King Charles has appeared to briefly lose his patience.
Something has shifted inside the royal family, and what makes this so explosive is not just the idea of Catherine being elevated. It is what that elevation seems to say about everyone else. Because if King Charles has in effect placed Catherine at the emotional center of the monarchy, then this is no longer a simple story about titles, protocol, or palace etiquette. This becomes a story about trust, about succession, about who is seen as temporary and who is seen as essential. And once you look at it that way, the real issue is not whether Catherine was praised. The real issue is why the palace would need to signal so clearly that the future now runs through her. If you enjoy these deep royal breakdowns, stay with me, because this one is layered. On the surface, it looks like a quiet internal adjustment, but underneath that, it feels like one of the clearest statements yet about where the monarchy is emotionally heading, who is being protected, and who may already be losing ground. Because in this family, nothing this symbolic ever happens by accident. The reaction began almost immediately. People did not just hear that Catherine had been placed in a newly central role. They heard something deeper. They heard that the woman once introduced to the family as William's wife is now being treated as the stabilizing force around which the next era of the monarchy may revolve. And that matters. It matters because the royal family does not only run on law. It runs on symbolism, mood, loyalty, and silent signals. Sometimes the most important changes are not written in giant public announcements. They are felt in the way one person is moved to the center while another quietly discovers that the room no longer turns toward them in the same way. That is where this gets interesting. Because Catherine's rise in this framing is not just about admiration, it is about institutional confidence. She has come to represent something the monarchy desperately needs right now: calm without passivity, glamour without chaos, visibility without recklessness, and duty without constant explanation. In a royal household that has spent years battling scandal, fracture, resentment, and competing narratives, that kind of presence is not decorative. It is strategic, and if Charles has truly made a final palace order that effectively crowns Catherine as the family's new matriarch in practice, even if not in constitutional language, then what he is really doing is choosing the emotional architecture of the future monarchy before that future formally arrives. Now think about how loaded that is. A matriarch inside a family like this is not merely an older woman with status. She is the person who becomes the point of internal gravity, the person younger members look toward, the person expected to steady tempers, soften fractures, host unity, protect continuity, and quietly preserve the family shape, while the institution keeps moving. In ordinary families, that role may emerge naturally. In royal families, it is never just natural. It is political, symbolic, and deeply personal all at once. So if Catherine is now being seen in that role, what does that mean for Queen Camilla? That is the question that gives this whole story its sting. Because Camilla has the public title. She has the formal position beside the king. She has spent years trying to move from tolerated figure to accepted senior royal. She has done the walkabouts, the causes, the service, the difficult smiling through old public judgment. Whatever people think of her personally, she has put in the work. That part is true. But monarchy is ruthless in one particular way. It can give you rank without giving you emotional centrality. It can seat you at the front while quietly deciding that the future heartbeat of the family lies elsewhere. And if that is what Charles has now signaled, then Camilla's title survives, but her symbolic reach may not. That is why this lands harder than it looks. Because the tension here is not really Catherine versus Camilla in some simple tabloid sense. It is bloodline versus marriage in access, future versus present, legacy versus arrangement. One woman is the king's wife. The other is the mother of a future king and the wife of the next monarch. One entered the dynasty, the other extends it. And in a family built around continuity, that difference is enormous. For years, Catherine's power has looked soft. That is exactly why people underestimate it. She does not usually dominate a room by force. She does not need to. Her strength has been built through patience, self-control, timing, public trust, and a kind of disciplined emotional intelligence that royal life rewards far more than many outsiders realize. She rarely rushes to answer every criticism. She rarely competes for the spotlight in a frantic way. She lets the image build slowly. That can look passive from a distance. It is not passive. It is old-school royal strategy in modern form. And Charles, for all his complexities, understands symbolism probably better than most people around him. So if he has now chosen to place Catherine in a position that feels matriarchal, he is not merely complimenting her. He is making a succession-era statement. He is saying that the monarchy cannot afford emotional confusion at the top of the family. It cannot have too many competing female centers. It cannot drift into a situation where the public future and the private hierarchy are pointing in different directions. At some point, someone has to become the clear bridge between this reign and the next one. Catherine was always the obvious candidate. But obvious does not mean painless, because the road to this point did not happen in a vacuum. It happened after years in which the royal family has looked increasingly fragile behind the formal photographs. You had a monarchy trying to modernize while carrying old wounds. You had family relationships shaped by grief, remarriage, public distrust, generational differences, and the constant pressure of image management. You had Charles trying to secure his own reign after waiting a lifetime for it. You had William and Catherine slowly becoming the dependable center the public instinctively turns to. And through all of that, there has been one uncomfortable truth lingering in the background. The monarchy's long-term emotional legitimacy does not rest equally on every senior figure. That may sound harsh, but it is the kind of reality palaces notice even when they do not say it out loud. William matters because he is the heir. George matters because he is the line after William. Catherine matters because she is tied to both. She is not adjacent to succession. She is woven into it. She is raising the children through whom the crown continues. She is the public mother of the next generation of monarchy. That gives her a different kind of gravity from anyone whose importance comes only through marriage to the current sovereign. And once Charles begins to think in those terms, the logic changes. What looks like favoritism starts to look like planning. What looks like a personal preference starts to look like institutional protection. What looks like a quiet honor starts to look like a transfer of family weight. And that is where Camilla's position becomes so delicate, because the more Catherine is elevated as the woman who embodies the future, the more Camilla risks being cast as belonging to a closing chapter rather than an opening one, not erased, not humiliated outright, but gently confined to the reign she helped support, rather than the monarchy that comes after it. That is a brutal distinction, and royal families specialize in brutal distinctions delivered with polite language. Here is the thing. The palace almost never says, "You matter less now." It does something subtler. It shifts access. It shifts expectation. It shifts who hosts, who mediates, who is consulted first, who stands beside whom, whose judgment is treated as steady, whose presence is framed as continuity, whose role feels necessary rather than ceremonial. Those are the moves that tell the real story. And if Catherine is now being framed as the family's new matriarch, then the story being told is clear. She is not simply preparing for queenship someday. She is already being asked to behave like the woman who holds the house together before the crown even reaches her head. That is a massive ask. It also tells you something revealing about Charles. Because for all the attention around who gains from this, there is also the question of why the king would do it now, and the answer may be uncomfortable. A move like this suggests not confidence in the family's natural cohesion, but concern that cohesion needs help. It suggests Charles knows the institution is entering a sensitive period. He knows William and Catherine are no longer just popular younger royals. They are the public emotional reserve of the monarchy. He knows every internal imbalance now carries future consequences. And perhaps most of all, he knows that trying to hold every relationship together personally may no longer be realistic. That is what gives this story its melancholy edge, because it can be read as an act of trust in Catherine. But it can also be read as an admission from Charles that the family has reached a point where the next stabilizer must already be in place. That is not triumph. That is transition. And transitions inside royal families are rarely smooth, even when everyone smiles. Imagine what this looks like from William's side. For him, Catherine's elevation is not just flattering, it is protective. It means the woman beside him is being recognized not merely as his spouse, but as a central royal force in her own right. It means the family unit he has built with her, and especially the world around George, Charlotte, and Louis, is being marked as the core through which the monarchy's next emotional identity will be shaped. That matters to William because he has always seemed intensely aware of how family instability damages royal life from the inside out. He grew up inside the consequences of that. So of course he would want firm boundaries. Of course he would want clarity around who guides his children. Of course he would prefer a future in which Catherine's authority is already understood, rather than constantly negotiated. In that sense, a move like this would not feel theatrical to him, it would feel necessary. But necessity for one person can feel like displacement for another. And that brings us back to Camilla. The difficult truth is that Camilla's journey has always depended on managed acceptance. She was never going to occupy the same emotional place in the national imagination as Diana. She was never going to be embraced in exactly the same way as Catherine. Her role had to be built through endurance and gradual normalization. She could become respected in function. She could become tolerated in presence. She could even become admired in certain circles for resilience and service. But becoming the emotional center of the future family was always a far harder mountain to climb. Not because she did nothing, but because monarchy remembers origins. It remembers who was born into the line, who married the heir, who produced the heirs, who symbolizes continuity, who carries past controversy, and who can credibly embody the next chapter without reopening the old one every time they enter the frame. That is why Catherine's symbolic strength is so potent. She does not trigger a legitimacy argument, she quiets one. And that is worth gold inside the palace. The more you sit with this, the more it starts to feel less like a dramatic palace surprise and more like an inevitable sorting process finally becoming visible. For years, the institution may have been trying to keep multiple realities going at once. Charles as sovereign, Camilla as queen beside him, William and Catherine as future anchors, Anne as the trusted old-school enforcer of duty. Different roles, different lanes, different emotional claims. That can work for a while, but eventually, the monarchy has to decide which center is merely current and which center is enduring. That decision, once exposed, changes the atmosphere immediately, even if nothing outwardly explodes. Even if no one gives an emotional interview, even if everyone appears united in public. Because once a family knows where the future trust is flowing, it behaves differently. Courtiers adjust, invitations change tone. Younger royals notice who is being treated as the household's natural point of calm. Staff begin to understand whose preferences are the ones to anticipate. The public starts reading photographs more closely. One shift creates 10 more. And that is how real royal power often moves. Quietly first, then all at once. There is also something profoundly revealing about the kind of femininity being rewarded here. Catherine's rise in this story is not based on noise. It is based on steadiness. Not rebellion, but endurance. Not overt domination, but controlled influence. That is very monarchy-coded. The institution has always been more comfortable with women who wield immense power through discipline, symbolism, and emotional containment than with women who appear to seize it in a visibly aggressive way. Catherine fits that model almost perfectly. Camilla, by contrast, has always carried the aura of someone who had to fight to stand where she stands. That creates a different energy, more defensive, more contingent, more vulnerable to being recast the moment the institution decides it wants softer continuity rather than hard-won access. Again, that does not make Camilla unimportant. It makes her importance more limited than her title might suggest. And titles can be deceptive in royal life. People hear queen and assume full emotional authority. But history keeps reminding us that rank and influence are not identical. A person can wear the formal role and still not define the family's center of gravity. Another person can have no crown yet and still become the figure everyone instinctively orients around. That seems to be the zone Catherine is entering now, which is why this feels bigger than one palace order. It feels like Charles may be writing the emotional preface to William's reign while he is still alive to do it. That matters enormously. Because if the current king publicly or privately marks Catherine as the family's trusted unifier, then William ascends one day with fewer internal ambiguities around the woman beside him. She is not arriving at the center cold. She has already been placed there. That makes transition easier. It makes hierarchy cleaner. It makes the future feel less experimental and more prepared. And in monarchy, preparedness is half the battle. Of course, none of this means all tension disappears. In fact, moves like this often bury tension even as they solve it. Camilla may smile, Charles may insist this is about unity. Catherine may carry the role with grace rather than triumph. William may present a calm face. But emotions do not vanish because the structure becomes clearer. They simply become less public and more refined. That is why the ending of this story does not feel neat. If Catherine is now the royal family's new matriarch in everything but explicit constitutional wording, then the monarchy has made a choice about where its moral and emotional future lives. That is powerful. But it also quietly confirms that the family needed that choice made. And once a family reaches that point, it means the old balance was no longer holding. Maybe that was always going to happen. Maybe Charles finally accepted what everyone around him could already see. Maybe the institution decided that if the future is going to survive, it must be anchored early and clearly in the branch of the family that actually carries it forward. And maybe that is the most revealing part of all. Not that Catherine was elevated, but that the palace seems to understand exactly why she had to be, because this is not just about affection. It is not just about image. It is not just about rewarding the most popular royal woman in the room. It is about inheritance in the deepest sense. Who inherits trust? Who inherits centrality? Who inherits the right to hold the family together when formality is not enough? Who becomes the face of continuity not on paper, but in instinct? That role cannot be borrowed forever. Sooner or later, it settles somewhere. And if it has now settled on Catherine, then the monarchy has quietly told us what its next chapter is supposed to feel like. Less improvised, less emotionally fragmented, less dependent on old compromises, and more rooted in the Wales family as the undeniable core. Camilla may still be queen, Charles may still be king, but the emotional map of the royal family may already be shifting toward the reign after this one. And that is why this story is so difficult to ignore. Because once the family's real center starts moving, everything else begins moving with it. And I think that is the question hanging over all of this now. Not whether Catherine can carry that kind of role, because by this point most people assume she can. The real question is what it means that the monarchy appears to need her to carry it this soon, this clearly, and this publicly. Does this mark healthy preparation for the future, or does it reveal how fragile the internal balance had already become behind the scenes? Let me know what you think, because this one goes far beyond one palace order. If Catherine has truly become the family's new matriarch in practice, then we may have just watched the monarchy show us, without fully saying it, exactly where it believes its safest future now lies.